August 18, 1966, a rubber plantation 5 kilometers east of an Australian military base in South Vietnam. 108 Australian soldiers have been fighting for their lives against a force 20 times their size for nearly 3 hours. They're surrounded. They're running out of ammunition. And above them, 2 helicopter pilots are about to attempt something that every regulation says is impossible. The radio crackles, running short of ammo, require drop through trees. This is the story of how a routine patrol walked into one of the most intense battles Australia has ever fought. In May 1966, Australia made a decision that would change everything. They expanded their commitment in Vietnam from a single battalion to an entire task force. The first Australian task force, nearly 4,500 men. They chose Phuoc Tuy province, southeast of Saigon, no Cambodian border, easy port access at Vung Tau, and most importantly, they'd operate independently. Australian command, Australian rules. But there was a problem. Phuoc Tuy had been Viet Cong territory since the French colonial days. The province was controlled by elements of the VC 5th Division, hardened main force units, not guerrillas, regular soldiers. Through May and June, Australian and American paratroopers cleared a buffer zone around their new base at Nui Dat, Operation Hardihood. 28 soldiers died in those clearing operations. They forcibly evacuated 2 villages, Long Phuoc and Long Tan. 1,500 villagers relocated, homes bulldozed. The Viet Cong were not happy about this, and by August, they were ready to do something about it. By mid-August 1966, Australian signals intelligence had been tracking something unusual. An unidentified radio transmitter was moving toward Nui Dat at about 1 kilometer per day, getting closer, getting closer. Then on August 14th, the transmissions went silent. 5 kilometers from the base. At 2:43 a.m. on August 17th, the Viet Cong opened fire on Nui Dat, 82 millimeter mortars and 75 millimeter recoilless rifles. Over 100 rounds in 22 minutes. The fire was accurate. They hit the artillery lines, the engineer compound, the coordination center. When the sun came up, B Company, 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment went out to find where the mortars had fired from. They found 5 mortar base plates, firing pits for 35 men, 22 expended recoilless rifle tubes. But then the trail went cold. Intelligence assessment, probably a heavy weapons platoon from the local battalion, maybe 30 to 40 men, probably long gone. 48 men from B Company were scheduled to return to base that morning. There was a concert happening. Australian entertainers, Call Joy, and Little Paddy. The first concert at Nui Dat, entertainment for troops who'd been in country for 10 weeks. So D Company, 6 RAR, was ordered to take over the search. 108 men, 105 Australians, and 3 New Zealanders from 161 Field Battery Artillery. Their commander was Major Harry Smith, 33 years old, Malayan emergency veteran. He led 3 rifle platoons under 2nd Lieutenants Jeff Kendall, Gordon Sharp, and Dave Sabin. The company sergeant major was Warrant Officer Jack Kirby, a short, tough Lewisham-born veteran. The medic was Corporal Phil Dobson. The New Zealand forward observer was Captain Maury Stanley, with bombardiers Willie Walker and Murray Broomhall. 2/3 of them had been in Vietnam less than 10 weeks. 11 of the 18 men who would die that day were National Servicemen. Conscripts, kids who'd been balloted in the draft. They left Nui Dat at 11 a.m. on August 18th. At 1 p.m., they met B Company at the eastern edge of a rubber plantation, the Long Tan Plantation, a mature French colonial grid. Rows of rubber trees planted in perfect lines stretching for over a kilometer, sparse undergrowth, red laterite soil. At 3 p.m., they entered the rubber, and above them, the southwest monsoon was building. At 3:35 p.m., 11 platoons lead section under 2nd Lieutenant Gordon Sharp ran into a small group of VC scouts at a track junction. One Viet Cong was killed. They recovered his AK-47. Sharp asked for permission to follow up. Major Smith approved it. What Sharp didn't know was that he'd just walked his 28-man platoon into the front of an entire regiment. The force waiting for them was between 1,500 and 2,000 men. The 275th Viet Cong Main Force Regiment, 3 battalions plus support companies, mortars, recoilless rifles, heavy machine guns, and critically, the regiment's 3rd Battalion was former North Vietnamese Army, regular soldiers who'd infiltrated from the north, plus the D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion to the southwest, ready to seal the trap. The plan was deliberate. The mortar attack the night before was bait. They wanted to draw Australian forces out and destroy them in the open. At 4:08 p.m., heavy machine gun fire erupted from 3 sides, AK-47s, Type 56 assault rifles, RPG fire, 75mm recoilless rifles, all opening up at once. 2 of Sharp's men died instantly. The platoon tried to reorient, but they were already being enveloped. Sharp called for fire support through Captain Maury Stanley, the New Zealand artillery officer. The New Zealand 161 Battery had been standing by since 3:42 p.m. They started dropping rounds within minutes. By 4:19 p.m., Stanley had escalated to a fire mission regiment. Every Australian and New Zealand 105mm howitzer, all 18 guns, plus 6 American 155mm self-propelled guns, 24 guns total. The first regimental fire mission since Korea. And then the monsoon hit. Sheets of rain. Visibility dropped to 50 meters. Lightning struck the 161 battery gun position at Nui Dat, knocking out 2 gunners in the loudspeaker system. The New Zealanders had to relay fire orders by shouted voice. At about 4:30 p.m., Gordon Sharp was killed, shot while standing to direct fire. Sergeant Bob Buick took command of what was left of 11 platoon. Their radio antenna was shot away. They were cut off. Major Smith brought 10 platoon forward under 2nd Lieutenant Kendall to relieve them. Then 12 platoon under 2nd Lieutenant Dave Sabin to extract the survivors. The artillery was firing at 6 to 8 rounds per gun per minute, 2 rounds above the official intense rate. Cordite fumes trapped under the storm made gunners pass out. Cooks and drivers were pressed into ammunition handling. At 5:02 p.m., the message that changed everything came through running short of ammo. Require drop through trees. Back at Nui Dat, an argument broke out in the Fire Support Coordination Center. Group Captain Peter Raw, the Royal Australian Air Force Air Commander, initially refused to put helicopters into the storm. Standing orders forbade it. Flying in that weather was against every regulation. Brigadier Jackson, the task force commander, reportedly said, "Well, I am about to lose a company. What the hell's a few more choppers and a few more pilots?" 2 pilots walked in, Flight Lieutenant Frank Riley and Flight Lieutenant Cliff Dole. They said they would fly anyway. 2 Iroquois helicopters lifted into low cloud about 5:50 p.m. with belted ammunition, grenades, and water roped in blankets. They flew at treetop height. Riley's co-pilot, Bob Grandin, navigated by looking down through a Perspex floor panel between his boots. The first run aborted on wrong-colored smoke. The second went in on yellow smoke from company headquarters. The boxes dropped almost at the feet of Company Sergeant Major Jack Kirby. You bloody beaut, that was smack on. Meanwhile, the relief column was rolling. Lieutenant Adrian Roberts' 3 Troop, 1 APC Squadron, 10 M113 armored personnel carriers carrying a company. They were held at the wire, then halted at the swollen Suoi Da Bang Creek. Roberts pushed across with 6 APCs. Water washed over the tops of the hulls. South of D Company, they ran straight into D445 Battalion, closing the trap. Corporal Peter Clements, manning a .50 caliber machine gun, was mortally wounded across the chest. Sergeant Noel Lowes sprinted 100 meters through fire to take over his vehicle. Driver Jeff Newman drove the lead APC flat out into enemy fire. Corporal John Carter's 50 cal jammed, so he climbed onto his roof and killed a recoilless rifle crew with an old Owen submachine gun. At about 6:55 p.m., the APCs broke through into D Company's perimeter, scattering a final assault wave that had been forming up. Major Harry Smith later said, "All firing ceased as though the tap was turned off." The rain stopped within minutes.
First indication was when 11 platoon, that's about 30 men, in the front of our column, contacted about 6 enemy soldiers on a track. We believe we killed one and wounded one, and they immediately bugged out east. Now, because there were only 6 or 7 of them and they'd already taken casualties, the company commander detached 11 platoon. They were in pursuit, so they couldn't call in artillery. But within about 15 minutes, they were following the enemy, who had paused at a hut and had gone another about 200 yards or so. And the 11 platoon was following them up at haste, when suddenly they came to a clearing in the rubber, and on the other side of the clearing, in terms that they use, the whole ground floor lit up, meaning that everyone was lying on the other side of the clearing and shooting at them. And basically now they had struck a stable enemy. So they went to ground, they took casualties straight away, but they went to ground and formed a defensive perimeter, but now they knew they were in a one place, so they could then call in artillery. The enemy facing 11 outnumbered us. That would have been foolish to deliberately go forward and allow ourselves to be surrounded. So the next option would have been to send a platoon, which he did, to send 10 platoon in a left hook, send them around to the left, and to position that they could fire across the front of 11 platoon and suppress them, take their mind off 11 platoon, and allow 11 platoon the time and space to gather their people and do a fire and movement back. That is, part of it moves back in support, part of it moves back, so on.
Dave Sabin later recalled, "Nothing could prepare you for it. I'd been in the Army a year and a month, and to come into what was essentially a pitched conventional battle. No amount of training could prepare you for how to cope with it. When D Company returned the next morning, the rain had washed most of 11 platoons dead almost clean. They were lined up in their firing positions, still facing east, weapons in their hands. 18 Australians killed, 24 wounded. 17 from D Company died on August 18th. Corporal Peter Clements of the APC squadron died of his wounds 9 days later. The youngest was Private Francis Topp, 19 years old. The average age was 21. 11 were National Servicemen. 11 platoon was effectively destroyed. The Australian sweep counted 245 enemy bodies on the battlefield. But a captured VC dispensary list seized 3 years later attributed 878 killed, missing, or died of wounds to Long Tan. A 1969 defector said losses were well in excess of 1,000. Vietnamese unit history published in 2004 claims only 47 dead, but Australian historian Ernie Chamberlain's later work on death certificates documents at least 190, named 275th Regiment soldiers killed. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Several hundred dead, hundreds more wounded and carried away overnight. The numbers tell the real story. Over 3.5 hours, the 24-gun fire support group fired approximately 3,500 rounds. Captain Maury Stanley ran an estimated 61 fire missions without ever seeing where the shells landed. Working off a mud-soaked map, he brought fire from 200 meters down to 30 meters from his own men. The American reaction was immediate. General Westmoreland called it a most significant victory over the enemy and one of the most spectacular in Vietnam to date. D Company received the U.S. Presidential Unit Citation in 1968, only the 2nd Australian unit ever honored this way. But Australian recognition was another story. Major Harry Smith was recommended for a Distinguished Service Order. He received the Military Cross. Warrant Officer Jack Kirby was recommended for the Victoria Cross. He received the Distinguished Conduct Medal. 2nd Lieutenants Kendall and Sabin were both recommended for military crosses. They received mentions in dispatches. 2nd Lieutenant Gordon Sharp, who died leading his platoon, received nothing. Kirby never saw the battle's anniversary. A misdirected artillery round killed him, and 3 other Australians during Operation Tambourine on February 6, 1967. Harry Smith spent the next 40 years fighting the system. In 2008, his military cross was upgraded to the Star of Gallantry. Sabin and Kendall received medals for gallantry. D Company was awarded the Unit Citation for Gallantry. In 2010, Cliff Dole received a posthumous Distinguished Service Medal for the ammunition run. The battle's afterlife runs through the Long Tan Cross, erected by 6 RAAF and New Zealand forces on the 3rd anniversary in 1969, removed after 1975, recovered in 1984. In 2017, Vietnam gifted the original cross to Australia. It's been on permanent display at the Australian War Memorial since August 2018. On the 50th anniversary in 2016, the Vietnamese government canceled a planned commemoration at the last minute. More than 1,000 Australian veterans were already in country. Only small groups were permitted through. August 18th is now Vietnam Veterans Day in Australia, declared by Prime Minister Bob Hawke in 1987. The Battle of Long Tan was not the turning point of the Vietnam War. The Viet Cong 5th Division was damaged, but not destroyed. They would fight on through 1971. What Long Tan did was matter at exactly the level the Viet Cong had hoped to attack, the level of confidence. The planned blow against Nui Dat collapsed. The 1st Australian Task Force spent the rest of its tour with operational initiative in Phuoc Tuy. But the deeper story is less about whether 108 men beat 2,000. They did, narrowly, and only because of brilliant artillery coordination and an armored relief column that crossed a flooded creek under fire. The deeper story is about what those Australian veterans had to do for 40 years afterwards to make their own country admit what had happened. 108 men walked into a rubber plantation on August 18, 1966. 108 minus 18 walked out, and it took 4 decades for Australia to understand what they'd faced.